what is an entity tag. So if you're not familiar with this feature, it is an optional feature, and it is actually found under something called optional features in OpenAir. So let me just show you where that is really quick in the system. So if I click on Administration, and my internet's been very slow, Global Settings, and then down here in this Account area, you see this thing called Optional Features. That's where the entity tag feature is, and it's actually called User Tag Feature, Enable User Tag Feature. So you'll hear the word tag a lot. It all refers to the entity tag option. Okay, but it is associated. It is a way to associate values with a date range, and it only applies to users. So when you turn this feature on, a new tab shows up on your user record called User Entity Tag. And here's an example of what one looks like. So when you click in the User Entity Tag, it has a default entity tag section and a historical entity tag section. And the historical is where the dates start coming into play. So it's probably not very obvious by looking at this if you haven't seen this feature before, but I've got plenty of examples to kind of show you how this impacts things in the system. Starting with this one. So let's say we have a person who is in one department and then they move to another department. So they're in a department called subcontractors in our example, and now the department field is updated on that user record to put them into the NetSuite practice department. What happens is when you run a report, the department field doesn't have any intelligence about history. So if I run a report before I made the change, it shows this is a timesheet hours report for Jared. And so all the hours show up in July, August, and September. But let's say he changed departments from subcontractors to NetSuite practice on August 1st. When I make that change, if I rerun the same report, it says, oh, look, Jared's put all these hours in as part of NetSuite practice. So you'll see there's no intelligence to understand that July actually should remain with subcontractors and August and September should be with NetSuite practice. Because the department field, like many custom fields, department field is a standard field, but like many custom fields, if you change the value, anything historical is going to just automatically reflect that new value as well. And that's not what you want always. So with an entity tag, you could set up what's called a tag group, which is sort of a field, and so you could call this tag group department, and then you identify the attributes or the value list for that tag group. So I can put in there management, NetSuite practice, administration, and so forth. And these would be my departments then that I would use on user records. And in the case of my user, I could go back to Jared and I said, okay, so he's currently in the department, the tag group department under NetSuite practice, but historically he was in from May to end of July, he was in the subcontractor department. And when I do that, the entity tag supports the ability to recreate that same report that I was just showing you, but you can see how the hours line up to the right place. So the hours for subcontractor department show up in July like they should have, and August and September show up in NetSuite practice because that's what I told the system from the entity tag where it goes. Now the interesting thing here is if you look at this report, it says department/user as the subtotal, and if I go back to the previous report, it says department/user. The interesting thing about this report is I'm actually using two different department values. And let me show you that report in the system actually. So if I use the standard OpenAir department field, it's actually called department. Okay, so we have to be a little careful about naming conventions, of course. So you can see here I have department and then user. So that's what's given me my department user view on this report where there's no intelligence on history. If I want to use the entity tag though, what I would do is I would actually swap out that department field, and I would use the user's entity tag called department, which is this report right here. And when this comes up, you'll see that instead of using the standard department field, I'm actually using something called users with an apostrophe S department. This is how a tag group shows up in the list of values. And if I look at, my list of values here, if I do something like users, anything with users, you can see I've got a few different entity tags because employment status is one, included and utilization is one. So these are all, not all of them, but some of them are entity tags, and that's how you would do a search for that. You know, if I type department, you're going to see there's the standard department, and then I have the user entity tag department. And by looking at this on the report, it does look very similar on the output. Okay. Now, so what you end up doing is you end up subtotaling by the entity tag versus the standard field, and that gives you the way for the entity tag to take effect and look at the date ranges that you've put on the historical values. Now, some of you may be familiar with a field called cost center. So sometimes entity tags and cost centers are a kind of a conversation, because cost centers have a functionality in OpenAir where they have an inheritance scheme. You can have a cost center on a project and a user and a service and time entries and all that kind of stuff. And what cost center ends up on things like your time cost or your expenses is based on this inheritance. But the interesting thing about the cost centers is cost centers are date dependent. You just don't have very much control about the date. So if I change from cost center 1, 2, 3 to cost center 5, 6, 7, the next time I put a piece of time in, the next time I put a receipt in, that's when the change of the cost center may take effect, depending on my inheritance, because now any new cost records are going to get stamped with my cost center. But that's very dependent on the fact that I had to physically go and change a cost center. I can't go and set a date. I can't go backwards in time and say, okay, I should have done this 2 weeks ago. The nice thing about entity tags is you can do that. You have a manual date control because you're the one that's updating the history in the system. So you have the control to be able to say, nope, this person was actually, they transferred cost centers, so I'm going to go ahead and update the entity tag to show that. So some customers that have a real date, they need to control the dates very cleanly on user records because that's the primary reporting value for cost centers in their OpenAir system. They will tend to gravitate toward using entity tags instead of the standard cost center reporting value because they can control the dates better with entity tags. Not everyone has that luxury because some people have to have the cost centers driven by projects, and entity tags are only a user record situation right now. Okay. But there are quite a few common entity tags that people use that we've worked with individuals with. Utilization is a big one. And the reason for that is the utilization equations tend to rely on things like how many available days do you have, and when did you start employment, or when did you terminate employment, or when did you shift between departments, and you be able to contribute to that department or to the company during the time frame that you were hired. So as many of you know, the system itself does not come with a standard hire date or termination date type functionality. So when you want to make sure people are not dragging down your utilization because they're just no longer an employee, you used to have to do something with work schedules or schedule exceptions to try and get the numbers to come out right. If you use the entity tags, that actually gives you an ability for the entity tags to add the smartness to be able to say the person should only be part of this report when they were an employee. So utilization tends to have things like an employment status entity tag, whether somebody should be included in utilization or not entity tag. Geography is a big one, or reporting office. So I only want to look at people that are in Germany versus the UK versus North America or something like that. Department is the example I just showed, or practice. And of course, job codes. So people that shift around, they're solution architect, now they're a senior solution architect, now they're an executive architect, and so that gives you the ability to do capacity reports by the different ways people are tagged in the system, and supports their promotions or changing of jobs throughout the way. So the question you may be asking yourself is, when should I use an entity tag? And really the answer comes back, if there's any field on a user record where you wish you would have known what the value was in 2016 or 2017, because that would impact the way your metrics and your reports are coming out, that is a candidate to change into an entity tag. Now there are some downsides of using entity tag. We'll get to the end there. At the end of this, I'll talk about them. But really, that's when you have to start considering it. Like if I want to maintain history, entity tags allow us to maintain history for reporting. Now, when I showed you the entity tag feature, I showed you the top part of it has a default value, and the bottom part is a date range or a historical value. And there's really two ways that you can take advantage of these. And a lot of it has to do with if you have an integration or what just makes sense to you. So I would recommend picking one or the other. Don't try to do both because that may add confusion. But basically, if you use the default at the top, what the default is that's the value that's going to get picked up if the system cannot find anything in the historical date range that would apply to the report time frame that you're looking at. So if in the example that I see on the screen here, if I ran a report for 2017, that falls outside of the range of the historical, so it's going to pick up the default. If I ran a report from November 2016 to January 2017, it's going to pick up the historical value until December 10th, and then it'll pick up the default value from December 11th onward. Okay, so that's how we get that split. But you don't have to use the default value if you're concerned about having to put too much data in the historical entity tags. Another common practice is forget about default, simply put a history and a current plus future one in there as a placeholder. So like translating the same thing from above down below, you can see that the person was not an employee until the 10th of December, but they're currently an employee from 12/11 until the year 2030. So that's a placeholder. When they're terminated, you end up changing the end date to their termination date, and then you end another one in there that says from 2030 on, or you can use at that point you could use a default if you want to say they're no longer employed. So there are some different ways to look at this because the date range is respected in all the reporting. Okay. So here's a real example of how an entity tag can help maintain information over time. So we're going to say, Jody is hired by this company on March 15th in 2016. So I set her up as currently employed. She's in the NetSuite practice, and she gets included in utilization. And then historically, because she didn't start until March 15th, I'm going to say she was not an employee and should not be in utilization prior to March 15th. And that way she doesn't have a negative impact on reporting. But I have a policy in my company that says once you hire, you get 90 days before you really should be impacting utilization. So here what I would do is I would change the entity tag a little bit to add 3 months, loosely 90 days, to the included in utilization portion. So now on reporting, even though the person shows up, maybe I'm doing timesheet status reporting, they're going to show up in timesheet status reports, but they're not going to show up on utilization because there's a 3-month gap before that starts getting impacted. And then maybe after the first year, Jody is promoted to be a manager, but a manager does not get included in utilization. So therefore, you can change the entity tag now so they're in a different department. So I put a historical department in here for the NetSuite practice. And then I changed the utilization to no again, but I put a historical entry to say, you were only part of utilization for this short time frame. And then after that, another year goes by, and Jody decides to leave the organization. So now I've updated the entity tag to say they're not currently employed, and now I've updated the employment status with a historical entry to say they were employed for 3/15, it should have been 16, sorry about that, that's a typo, to 3/14/18. So the entity tag is actually helping keep everything in line with reporting, and that's how it can evolve. You don't delete anything, you just keep adding to it. Now, custom calculations are factors using the entity tags because there are also filters available, just like they can be filters and subtotals on reports. So you can create your own reporting values that support metrics that you want to compare by tag groups. And the timing of when people were in a department or included in utilization or in the geography will allow you to pull the data into those custom calculations based on the date range of the report and the setup of the entity tag historical values on the user record. So you can start doing things like here I have, I'm going to create a NetSuite practice utilization where I'm taking approved hours divided by work schedule hours, and then I'm going to filter it by users department NetSuite practice. And that way I'm only pulling in utilization for the NetSuite practice. And I can create my own reporting values that way. So now you can get things like capacity by job code or utilization by region, and you can put your reports together and graph them together so you can compare stuff side by side. And the entity tag controls when the time or the numbers or the money gets contributed to each of those entity tag categories. Okay, so now you have a lot of comparison options here. So as I get closer to the end here, I'm kind of going through it a little quickly because the pros and cons, there's some things to consider here. From a cons perspective, I want to start with the negative first. Okay, so when you turn on the user tag feature, the entity tag feature, that tag feature does add a layer of complexity to your database objects for reporting, because now the reports are not just pulling transaction dates when you do things like a time report or an expense report. They are pulling the data from those tables, and then it's doing a lookup against the entity tags to see which dates need to be totaled which categories. Okay, so you can assume that adds a layer of complexity. I have seen it impact report performance if you are doing a lot of tags. And when I say a lot, I mean more than 6 or 7 entity tags on a single user record. Not 6 or 7 entries, 6 or 7 different types of entity tags, like geography and language and including utilization and employment and job category, and you start adding way too many of those things, then it could start impacting reports, because the more entity tags you add, the more times you'll want to use them as filters or subtotals, and that just creates more query complexity for the reporting engine to do. But for the most part, most of the customers that we've worked with, 2 or 3 is usually sufficient for what they want to report in, and that doesn't impact the performance at all. Okay. Now, the other con is currently in the system, when you do use entity tags, it requires you to keep those up to date, just like everything else in OpenAir. But there isn't sort of a function to run or a maintenance report or anything that you can do that would automate that for you. So it is something that as people get onboarded or you terminate users, you'd have to go into those records and add those historical values and to keep the data up to date and clean. So there is an administration activity there, and with that type of activity, there's always some kind of timing control or expectation of update accuracy that you need to be aware of. We actually have worked with a few customers that have wanted to automate it, so we do have scripting options. If you look in our scripting library, we do have some scripting options if you'd like to talk to us about those. And really, it comes down to how do we know? How does OpenAir know? What in OpenAir can help realize that there is a termination that happened or a new hire where the script has to do some updates? And then other ways that we've solved it is just with integrations with an HR system. So part of a user onboarding or termination feed that happens to help you maintain just user accounts in general, that integration can also be enhanced to be able to manipulate the entity tag table and save yourself some headache. So it does require maintenance, just like anything else. So it's sort of a con, but the con can be mitigated or avoided by doing some automation activities if you want to think about those. Okay. The other thing about the entity tag, and this is something that you've probably run into before with OpenAir, is there are a lot of different ways to track data to be able to get the reports the way you want, or to be able to filter the data that you see on the screen the way you want. And in many cases, it's not just one field. You have to fill out 3 or 4 different fields, but it feels like you're putting the same value in 3 or 4 different fields, like a hierarchy and a department, a cost center, a custom field, an entity tag, and they all say NetSuite practice. And you're like, why am I filling out the same thing? Why isn't the system smart enough to know? Well, the system doesn't, those fields don't know about each other. That's why it's very redundant. Again, another scripting opportunity there. But sometimes it does feel like you're doing redundant stuff in an entity tag as well as in another field, and there might be valid reasons for doing that. Again, with maintenance, you'd want to look at potentially trying to minimize the redundant keystrokes that people have to make so that scripts can obviously fill that gap. Okay. And the other con, which you already picked up on, is it's only available on user records. So this only applies to users, so that's why it's great for things like utilization or capacity. Those are user or resource-based reporting. It doesn't apply to things like revenue by customer or anything like that. You can say how much revenue did a person get when they worked with a customer with an entity tag, but it's all resource-based at the moment. Now the pros are you have date control. That's probably the most important reason that people would want to use entity tags is the date control. So if something isn't updated in a timely manner, you have control of the dates, so therefore all of the reporting can still stay whole. And it does retain the historical state of the data in the system. The other key things are when you're dealing with utilization and you say the person got hired on March 15th, and you run a utilization report for the month of March, the utilization equations will accommodate the fact that the person should only be looked at from the 15th to the 31st of March, and therefore the utilization and available hours, such as work schedule hours, are only from the 15th to the 31st of March. So that's a very big plus in being able to get very accurate resource utilization reporting values. And a nice little bonus, especially if you're using things like the practice or the geography, in the resources module, you can, the advanced research search, and custom search actually can also search on entity tag in addition to the skill profile. So that's a big plus because the entity tag is the one thing that sort of straddles the user record and the skill database, because it can be used in the search option. You just have to tell the tag group that it's searchable. Okay. So entity tags, I'm a big proponent of using them for metrics, especially utilization, but they have come in are valuable for other things like capacity or geography and stuff like that. So you really need to look at the reporting and the need for historical reporting to be able to go look at year-over-year type things. That tends to point you to which pieces of information on a user record may have to be set up as an entity tag. Okay. Definitely consider the fact that entity tags are yet another piece of data to put in the system. So think about automations, integrations, or scripting that can help you maintain that data much easier. And it can factor into your whole resource scheduling process as well, which is a real big benefit in the end of the day. Okay.